The 1971 Bangladesh War did not erupt suddenly in December, nor was it merely a brief Indo-Pakistani conflict, but the violent culmination of a long-building political fracture that exposed the limits of post-colonial statehood, Cold War alliances, and the dangerous illusion that nuclear-armed powers could manipulate regional crises without consequence, because, at its core, the war grew out of the creation of Pakistan itself in 1947, a state divided not only by geography, but by language, culture, economics, and political power. With West Pakistan governing East Pakistan across more than 1,000 miles of Indian territory, an arrangement sustained through coercion rather than consent. From the beginning, East Pakistan, despite holding a majority of the population, was treated as a peripheral colony rather than an equal partner, exploited economically, underrepresented politically, and suppressed culturally, particularly through attempts to impose Urdu as a national language despite the overwhelming Bengali identity of the Eastern Wing, a decision that planted the earliest seeds of resistance and shaped a growing sense that independence from Britain had merely replaced one distant ruler with another. Over the decades that followed, these tensions hardened into structural inequality as economic development favored the West. Military power remained concentrated in West Pakistani hands, and political dissent in the East was repeatedly met with repression, reinforcing the perception that the Pakistani state existed to extract rather than represent. By the late 1960s, this imbalance had become untenable, as mass political mobilization in East Pakistan coalesced around demands for autonomy, democratic representation, and control over local resources, demands that were articulated most clearly by the Awami League under Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, whose platform reflected not secessionist ideology, but a federal vision that would effectively strip the central government of its dominance. The 1970 general election, Pakistan's first truly national vote, brought this contradiction into the open, as the Awami League won an absolute majority in the National Assembly, a result that should have allowed it to form the government under democratic norms, yet was perceived by West Pakistan's military and political elite as an existential threat to their authority. Rather than transfer power, the regime delayed, negotiated in bad faith, and ultimately chose force, a decision that marked the irreversible descent toward catastrophe. In March 1971, the Pakistani military launched a sweeping crackdown in East Pakistan, aimed at crushing political opposition, neutralizing intellectual leadership, and restoring control through terror. An operation that rapidly escalated into mass violence against civilians, including students, professionals, minorities, and entire communities, producing one of the largest humanitarian crises of the Cold War era. This campaign shattered any remaining illusion of a unified Pakistan and transformed political struggle into a war for survival. As millions of civilians fled across the border into India, creating an unprecedented refugee crisis that overwhelmed neighboring regions and forced New Delhi to confront the conflict not as a distant tragedy, but as a direct threat to stability. India's response was shaped by both humanitarian and strategic calculations, as the influx of refugees strained resources and inflamed domestic pressure, while the opportunity to decisively weaken Pakistan, a rival with whom India had already fought multiple wars, presented itself under conditions that favored intervention. Yet India's leadership also understood that military action carried risks far beyond the subcontinent, because the 1971 crisis unfolded at the height of Cold War realignment, when global power politics intersected directly with South Asian rivalries. Pakistan, despite its internal repression, occupied a critical position in U.S. foreign policy as a Cold War ally and as a secret diplomatic channel to China, making Washington reluctant to challenge Islamabad, even as reports of atrocities mounted. The United States viewed Pakistan through the prism of containment and triangulation, prioritizing its strategic relationship over humanitarian concerns and framing the crisis as an internal matter, a stance that would later become one of the most controversial aspects of American Cold War diplomacy. China, for its part, saw Pakistan as a counterweight to India and a regional partner against Soviet influence, reinforcing Beijing's support for Islamabad and raising the specter that a regional war could draw in major powers. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, cultivated a closer relationship with India, culminating in a treaty that signaled political and strategic alignment, providing New Delhi with diplomatic cover and reassurance that intervention would not leave it isolated in the event of escalation. These alignments transformed what might otherwise have been a regional civil war into a Cold War flashpoint, where the outcome carried implications far beyond South Asia, affecting global perceptions of power, credibility, and alliance reliability. By the time India moved decisively in December 1971, the conflict had already claimed hundreds of thousands of lives and displaced millions, and the formal outbreak of war between India and Pakistan represented not the beginning, but the final act of a process driven by repression, resistance, and international paralysis. The speed and decisiveness of the military campaign reflected how thoroughly the ground had been prepared, as Indian forces, in coordination with Bengali fighters, rapidly overwhelmed Pakistani positions in the east, revealing the fragility of a state held together by force rather than legitimacy. Yet even as the war unfolded swiftly on the battlefield, its geopolitical implications unfolded more slowly and ominously as nuclear signaling, naval deployments, and diplomatic maneuvering underscored how close the crisis came to triggering a broader confrontation. The 1971 Bangladesh War thus stands not only as a war of independence, but as a Cold War event that exposed the moral compromises, strategic risks, and human costs of a global system willing to tolerate mass violence in pursuit of geopolitical advantage, setting the stage for a conflict whose consequences would reverberate through regional politics and nuclear strategy long after the guns fell silent. As the war moved from internal repression to open interstate conflict, the 1971 Bangladesh War entered its most dangerous and globally consequential phase, because what unfolded on the subcontinent now intersected directly with Cold War power politics, nuclear signaling, and the strategic credibility of major alliances, turning a regional struggle for self-determination into a crisis watched with alarm in Washington, Moscow, and Beijing. India's decision to intervene militarily was shaped by months of preparation and restraint, as New Delhi sought to avoid appearing as the aggressor, while quietly training and supporting Bengali resistance forces, calculating that legitimacy would matter as much as battlefield success in managing international reaction. When Indian forces finally crossed into East Pakistan in early December, the campaign unfolded with extraordinary speed, as Pakistan's military position collapsed under the weight of coordinated offensives, popular resistance, and logistical isolation, revealing how hollow control had become once legitimacy was lost. The rapid advance was not merely a tactical victory, but a political one, because it demonstrated that the Pakistani state could not sustain its authority in the East without unlimited violence, and that once external pressure and internal resistance converged, collapse was inevitable. This outcome, however, alarmed the United States, which viewed the conflict through the lens of Cold War alignment rather than humanitarian catastrophe, fearing that India's victory, backed diplomatically by the Soviet Union, would signal a shift in the balance of power in South Asia and undermine American credibility among its allies. Washington's response was constrained by its own strategic priorities, as Pakistan served as a critical intermediary in secret diplomacy with China, making Islamabad indispensable to a broader realignment that American leaders considered more important than the fate of East Pakistan's population. This calculus produced a moral and strategic contradiction, as U.S. officials downplayed or ignored reports of mass atrocities while publicly calling for restraint, a stance that eroded America's image in the region and exposed the limits of values-based diplomacy during the Cold War. China, closely aligned with Pakistan and wary of India's growing influence, issued warnings and diplomatic support to Islamabad, yet stopped, short of direct intervention, constrained by geography, military readiness, and the risk of confrontation with the Soviet Union, whose treaty with India served as a powerful deterrent against escalation. The Soviet Union's role was decisive in shaping the conflict's boundaries, as Moscow provided India with political cover and reassurances that discouraged Chinese intervention, illustrating how Cold War alliances could both enable regional war and prevent it from spiraling into superpower confrontation. This delicate balance was tested as the United States deployed naval forces toward the Bay of Bengal, a move intended to signal concern and support for Pakistan, yet one that risked misinterpretation in an already volatile environment, raising fears that naval posturing could escalate into a direct clash between nuclear-armed powers. Indian leaders interpreted these movements as coercive pressure, reinforcing their determination to conclude the war swiftly before external intervention could alter the outcome, a calculation that underscored how Cold War signaling compressed decision-making and incentivized rapid, decisive action. The surrender of Pakistani forces in Dhaka and the creation of Bangladesh as an independent state marked a dramatic geopolitical shift, reshaping South Asia's strategic landscape and delivering one of the most decisive military outcomes of the Cold War era. Yet the swiftness of victory did not diminish the war's dangers, because the crisis had revealed how easily regional conflicts could become entangled with nuclear signaling and alliance politics, creating situations where miscalculation could have triggered far wider catastrophe. The 1971 war thus exposed the fragility of Cold War crisis management, showing that while superpowers sought to control escalation, their interventions often heightened risk and constrained options for local actors. In Bangladesh, independence brought relief, but also devastation, as the new nation faced the monumental task of rebuilding after genocide, displacement, and war, while navigating a global system that had failed to prevent its suffering. The war's aftermath would leave enduring scars on regional politics, deepen mistrust between India and Pakistan, and accelerate Pakistan's pursuit of nuclear weapons, a direct consequence of perceived vulnerability and humiliation that reshaped South Asian security for decades. In this sense, the 1971 Bangladesh War was not an isolated episode, but a turning point, revealing how Cold War alignments could both determine outcomes and sow the seeds of future instability, ensuring that the conflict's legacy would extend far beyond the moment of independence. As the immediate fighting ended and Bangladesh emerged as a new state, the deeper consequences of the 1971 war began to unfold, revealing how profoundly the conflict had altered the strategic psychology of South Asia and exposed the long-term costs of Cold War crisis management, because the war's decisive outcome did not resolve regional tensions so much as reconfigure them around new fears, grievances, and ambitions shaped by humiliation, mistrust, and the shadow of nuclear escalation. For Pakistan, the loss of East Pakistan was not merely a territorial defeat, but a foundational trauma that shattered the legitimacy of the state's ruling elite and reinforced a narrative of existential vulnerability, convincing military planners that conventional inferiority could only be offset by acquiring nuclear capability, a conclusion that would drive Pakistan's strategic choices for decades and fundamentally alter the balance of power in the region. This shift was inseparable from the Cold War context, as Pakistan's leaders interpreted the war as evidence that alliances and diplomatic assurances were unreliable in moments of crisis, and that survival depended on possessing weapons that could deter even a stronger adversary, embedding nuclear ambition into national identity and security doctrine. India, despite its victory, emerged with its own set of anxieties, as the war underscored how rapidly regional conflicts could draw in external powers and expose India to coercive signaling by distant actors, reinforcing the belief that strategic autonomy required not only military strength, but diplomatic insulation from superpower pressure. This belief would later influence India's own nuclear trajectory, as leaders sought to ensure that future crises could not be manipulated by outside forces exploiting vulnerability. Bangladesh, meanwhile, faced the daunting task of nation-building under conditions shaped by trauma and dependency, as the new state navigated reconstruction while managing relationships with patrons whose support had been decisive, but whose interests did not always align with long-term stability. The humanitarian catastrophe that accompanied the war left deep social scars, as mass displacement, famine, and economic collapse challenged the capacity of the fledgling government and exposed the limits of international response mechanisms that had failed to prevent or halt atrocities during the conflict. The Cold War's moral contradictions were laid bare in Bangladesh's early years, as global powers that had maneuvered diplomatically during the war now competed for influence in reconstruction, reframing engagement in terms of development and aid, while avoiding accountability for earlier inaction. Regionally, the war entrenched hostility between India and Pakistan, ensuring that the line of conflict shifted westward rather than disappearing, as unresolved disputes and mutual suspicion persisted, now intensified by the memory of decisive defeat and the fear of future intervention. The Simla Agreement, intended to stabilize relations and formalize post-war arrangements, reflected a mutual desire to manage rivalry without external interference. Yet, it also revealed how fragile trust remained, as commitments to bilateralism coexisted uneasily with continued militarization and strategic hedging. The war's impact extended beyond South Asia, influencing how superpowers approached regional conflicts in the developing world, reinforcing the lesson that proxy alignments could deliver short-term gains, but at the cost of long-term instability and nuclear proliferation, outcomes that complicated global security far beyond the original theater. The 1971 crisis also demonstrated how humanitarian disasters could be subordinated to strategic priorities, a pattern that would recur throughout the Cold War, undermining international norms and eroding faith in moral leadership. Over time, the war became a reference point in nuclear-era thinking, illustrating how decisive conventional outcomes could paradoxically increase nuclear risk by motivating defeated states to seek ultimate deterrence, transforming regional balances in unpredictable ways. In this sense, the Bangladesh War stands as a pivotal moment when Cold War dynamics intersected with post-colonial statehood to produce consequences that reshaped not only national borders, but the strategic logic of an entire region. Its legacy lies in showing that wars fought under nuclear shadow rarely end with clear resolution, because the trauma of defeat, the memory of abandonment, and the fear of repetition continue to shape behavior long after formal hostilities cease, ensuring that the 1971 conflict remains embedded in South Asia's security landscape as both a warning and a wound that never fully healed. The Cold War dimension of the 1971 Bangladesh War becomes even clearer when viewed through the lens of crisis restraint and escalation control, because the conflict demonstrated how superpowers attempted to manage regional wars not by preventing them, but by shaping their boundaries, accepting violence up to a certain threshold while signaling limits beyond which escalation would become unacceptable. Throughout the crisis, Washington, Moscow, and Beijing operated on parallel tracks of intervention and restraint, seeking to protect their strategic interests without triggering direct confrontation, a balancing act that depended on rapid signaling, alliance discipline, and a shared understanding that nuclear war remained the ultimate line that could not be crossed. This implicit coordination did not reflect cooperation so much as mutual fear, as each power recognized that miscalculation in South Asia could cascade into a broader confrontation at a moment when global tensions were already high. The deployment of naval forces, the issuance of diplomatic warnings, and the invocation of alliance commitments all served as tools of influence rather than preparation for direct combat, illustrating how Cold War power was exercised through demonstration rather than execution. Yet these signals also carried inherent risk because they compressed decision-making and heightened anxiety among regional actors, who were forced to interpret ambiguous gestures under intense pressure, increasing the chance that defensive measures could be misread as offensive intent. India's determination to conclude the war swiftly was shaped by this environment, as leaders understood that prolongation would invite deeper external involvement and potentially alter the outcome, reinforcing the incentive to achieve decisive results before superpower intervention could harden. This dynamic reveals a paradox at the heart of Cold War crisis management, that the effort to prevent escalation often encouraged rapid, overwhelming action by local actors seeking to preempt external constraint. Pakistan, isolated diplomatically and militarily in the East, experienced this pressure as abandonment, a perception that intensified post-war resentment and reinforced narratives of betrayal that would shape its strategic culture, including the belief that only nuclear weapons could guarantee survival in a world where alliances were conditional and interest-driven. The war thus accelerated nuclear proliferation dynamics in South Asia, not through abstract deterrence theory, but through lived experience of defeat and vulnerability under Cold War rules. Bangladesh's emergence as an independent state under these conditions highlighted the asymmetry of Cold War outcomes, as liberation was achieved at extraordinary human cost, while global powers adjusted narratives to suit their interests, reframing the conflict as a regional matter once its immediate strategic implications had been managed. The international community's rapid shift from crisis diplomacy to normalization underscored how Cold War systems absorbed shocks by moving on rather than reckoning with consequences, leaving post-war societies to bear the burden of reconstruction and trauma with limited accountability from those who had shaped the conflict's parameters. The 1971 war also influenced future superpower behavior, reinforcing caution about overt intervention while validating indirect influence and signaling as preferred tools, a lesson that would inform later crises in which restraint coexisted with proxy engagement. Yet this restraint was selective, applied primarily to prevent superpower war rather than to protect civilian populations, revealing the moral hierarchy embedded in Cold War strategy. The Bangladesh War thus stands as a case study in how nuclear-era conflict management prioritized system stability over human security, producing outcomes that were strategically contained but socially devastating. Its legacy challenges narratives that portray the Cold War as a period of managed peace, reminding us that stability at the global level often depended on the tolerance of extreme violence at the regional level. In understanding this war, we see how Cold War logic transformed local struggles into tests of credibility and alignment, and how the successful avoidance of superpower confrontation did not equate to the prevention of catastrophe, but rather to its displacement onto societies deemed peripheral, a pattern that would repeat across the developing world with enduring consequences. As the decades passed, the 1971 Bangladesh War came to be understood not only as a moment of liberation or a decisive military victory, but as a structural turning point that reshaped how war, alliance, and nuclear risk were perceived across the post-colonial world, because it demonstrated with brutal clarity that Cold War power did not prevent violence so much as redistribute it, channeling catastrophe into regions where strategic interests outweighed humanitarian restraint. The war revealed how superpowers could tolerate, and in some cases indirectly enable, mass suffering so long as escalation remained controlled and their own vital interests were not directly threatened, a reality that profoundly undermined the moral claims of Cold War leadership and exposed the gap between rhetoric and practice. For South Asia, the conflict hardened a security environment defined by mistrust and deterrence, as both India and Pakistan internalized the lesson that decisive outcomes invited long-term instability rather than closure, with Pakistan's pursuit of nuclear weapons and India's gradual acceptance of its own nuclear trajectory, reflecting parallel responses to the trauma and uncertainty unleashed in 1971. This nuclearization of rivalry ensured that future crises would unfold under far more dangerous conditions, transforming conventional disputes into potential existential confrontations and embedding the memory of 1971 into strategic thinking on both sides. Bangladesh, while achieving independence, inherited the consequences of a war shaped by external priorities, as its early political development was constrained by economic devastation, institutional weakness, and the lingering influence of patrons whose involvement had been decisive, but whose commitment to long-term stability was limited, illustrating how Cold War victories often carried hidden costs for newly independent states. Internationally, the war reinforced a pattern in which humanitarian disaster failed to override strategic calculation, a lesson absorbed by policymakers and authoritarian regimes alike, who understood that alignment and utility could shield them from accountability, even in the face of mass violence. The conflict also reshaped diplomatic practice, as the use of backchannels, triangulation, and coercive signaling during the crisis became models for managing future confrontations, embedding secrecy and expediency into Cold War governance at the expense of transparency and international norms. In retrospect, the 1971 Bangladesh War stands as a warning about the long-term consequences of managing conflict through containment rather than resolution, because while the immediate crisis was contained, the underlying dynamics it unleashed, nuclear proliferation, entrenched hostility, and weakened international norms, continued to reverberate for decades. Its history challenges narratives that equate Cold War stability with peace, revealing instead a system that preserved order by accepting localized catastrophe and leaving behind legacies of trauma that shaped regional politics long after superpower attention shifted elsewhere. The war's enduring significance lies in how it exposed the limits of nuclear-era crisis management, showing that the avoidance of global war did not equate to the prevention of suffering, and that the strategic success of restraint could coexist with moral failure on a massive scale. In this sense, the Bangladesh War occupies a central place in Cold War history, not because it brought the world closest to nuclear annihilation, but because it revealed how the system functioned when it did not, demonstrating that the Cold War's most devastating effects were often felt not in moments of near apocalypse, but in conflicts that were allowed to burn precisely because they could be contained. Through this lens, the war stands as both an indictment and a lesson, reminding us that global stability built on selective restraint leaves behind unresolved wounds that continue to shape security, identity, and memory long after the shooting stops. The final meaning of the 1971 Bangladesh War emerges when it is understood not as an exception within the Cold War, but as a revelation of how the system truly operated, because the conflict showed that global stability was maintained not by preventing violence, but by managing where and how it was allowed to occur, ensuring that catastrophe unfolded within acceptable geographic and political boundaries rather than at the center of superpower confrontation. The war demonstrated that nuclear deterrence did not eliminate war, but reshaped it, channeling destruction into regions where alliances, leverage, and distance insulated major powers from direct consequence, while local populations absorbed the full human cost. The superpowers' behavior during the crisis exposed a hierarchy of concern in which credibility, alignment, and strategic positioning outweighed humanitarian obligation, revealing that Cold War morality was conditional and selective, applied primarily to avoid escalation among nuclear-armed states rather than to protect civilians caught in proxy conflicts. The creation of Bangladesh, while a moment of national liberation, was thus inseparable from the broader failure of the international system to prevent mass suffering, as independence was achieved only after genocide, displacement, and war were tolerated under the logic of containment. For Pakistan, the trauma of defeat reshaped national identity and security doctrine, accelerating the pursuit of nuclear weapons as a means of escaping vulnerability and humiliation, a decision that transformed South Asia into one of the most dangerous nuclear regions in the world and ensured that future conflicts would carry existential risk. For India, victory reinforced confidence, but also deepened awareness of how quickly regional wars could attract external pressure, encouraging a strategic culture that emphasized autonomy, deterrence, and eventual nuclear capability as safeguards against coercion. Bangladesh's post-war struggle highlighted how Cold War outcomes often left new states burdened with devastation and dependency, as the global powers that had influenced the conflict moved on, leaving reconstruction and reconciliation to those least equipped to manage them. The war's legacy thus extended far beyond its immediate outcome, reshaping regional politics, accelerating nuclear proliferation, and weakening international norms that claim to protect civilians from mass violence. In the broader Cold War narrative, the 1971 Bangladesh War stands as a case study in managed catastrophe, illustrating how the system succeeded in avoiding global war while failing catastrophically at the regional level, a pattern repeated across much of the developing world. Its history challenges the comforting idea that restraint alone constitutes success, reminding us that the absence of superpower conflict often masked the displacement of violence onto societies deemed peripheral. In this sense, the war serves as a mirror to the Cold War itself, reflecting a world order that preserved stability through selective indifference and strategic compromise, leaving behind unresolved wounds that shaped generations. The enduring lesson of the 1971 Bangladesh War is that peace defined solely as the avoidance of nuclear confrontation is incomplete and unstable, because it accepts immense human suffering as an acceptable cost, and that a system built on such logic may prevent apocalypse while still producing tragedy on a massive scale. In understanding this conflict, we confront the reality that the Cold War's most lasting impact was not only the crises that nearly destroyed the world, but the wars it allowed to happen precisely because they would not.